Hello, everyone. It is a delight to be with you. To begin our learning, I'd love to start with the blessing for studying Torah, which I just posted in the chat in Hebrew and in transliteration. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And we're going to just soak in the beginning of Job. And before we do, I would just like to invite anyone who has someone top of mind or top of heart. Maybe it's a yortzeit, an anniversary of a death, or maybe there's someone sick in your life or someone struggling or just someone you're thinking about. If you'd like to dedicate our learning today to someone, feel free to just do that in the chat right now and just let us know either their name or why you are dedicating our learning to them now. Learning Torah is a mitzvah, and when we do it together, we actually accrue merit. And so we're offering to direct this merit. So thank you. I see that in the chat, there are people who are being mentioned, and I'm reading them, and feel free to keep them coming. I'm going to continue teaching, but I hope that everyone will hold all of these people in their hearts as we continue to learn. And may our learning be of merit and of benefit, not only to us, but to them as well. Okay, so why Job? Why now? Why look at the book of Job? I will tell you a little bit about me and why I'm answering that question. And I'm curious, for all of you, why Job? Why this morning? So I have been involved in a project. There's an organization that arranges it, but it's easy to do it by yourself, called 929. And there are actually 929 chapters of the Torah, of the first 5 books of Moses, prophets, and writings. If you look at all of the chapters and you add them up, they're 929. And I've been involved in a group that's been reading 1 chapter a day. And I'm close to the end. It's been over 3 years now, close to the end. And I was recently reading through Job, which is in the writing section, the last third. And I was just so taken with it. I just thought it was fascinating. And most especially, it struck me in a way that I had never seen talked about before. And shortly after I was struck in this way, I heard from Julie, and she was asking if I wanted to teach. And I was like, yes, I want to teach Job. This is great. And so now that's how we've come. And one more word about it. Job, most people, if you know anything about Job, you know that it's a book shot through with suffering. And suffering, which if we can ever define it, as earned, right? The point of Job is that his suffering is not deserved. I'm not sure suffering is ever deserved, but the point of the book is to say his suffering is not deserved. And so when we look at it, we are thinking about our own suffering, the suffering we've experienced from others, the role of God in suffering, and most especially, I'm going to suggest what it's like to be a friend to someone who suffers, and what it's like to suffer and have your friends not really support you in the way that you wish they would. And so we're going to take a look at this ancient book. We're going to talk about exactly how ancient it is, but I hope that as we do, everyone will be taking their personal experiences, their own lived experiences of what it's like to both suffer and to be a friend to someone who suffers, to inform our discussion. And if you feel moved to let us know why Job for you, feel free to let us know in the chat. So what is this book? When was it written? Scholars argue about this, but in general, it's dated between the 4th and the 6th century BCE, before the Common Era. So it's very, very old. Professor Ed Greenstein, a Bible professor, says the Hebrew prose of the first chapters and the last chapter, we're going to talk about that, shows that it was composed in the post-Babylonian era after 540 BCE. Who wrote it? Again, we don't have an actual author. There are many different guesses about who could have written it, including, we'll see later, the prophet Ezekiel is one guess. Moses, we'll see, was assigned by the Talmud as the author of the book of Job. The person, another teacher of Bible, Rabbi Moshe Sokolow, who thinks that Ezekiel, the prophet, wrote the book, he said he did it in order to air and debate the various opinions over the cause of the destruction of the first temple that were circulating among the Babylonian exiles. So what he's saying here is that this book about suffering and God, often called theodicy, the study of why evil happens in a divine world, he's saying that it's happening not just because individual people experience suffering, but because the Jewish people, the Jewish civilization as a whole, was reeling from the suffering they experienced in not only the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, but in their exile, in the huge disruption and dislocation that the destruction caused. The language of this book is very difficult in the original Hebrew. It's difficult for many reasons. One, there are just a lot of weird anomalies in the grammar and in the syntax. It's famously difficult for Hebrew translators, and English translators, so there are no shortage of them. However, this book also has the most, here's a fun word for you, hapax legomenon, words that only show up once in the Torah. The book of Job has the most of these, the most words that don't show up anywhere else except for in this book, which again makes it hard for a translator to know if they get to a word they're not sure about, they can't go find it somewhere else and look for context clues. This book's language is so anomalous that the great medieval commentator Ibn Ezra said that he, and many scholars agree with him, thinks that it is a translated book, that it was originally written in another language and then moved over into Hebrew. And that's one of the reasons why its interpretation is difficult, because there are a lot of kind of between words. So even whenever how do you spell hapax legomenon? I will put it in the chat. And if there are any other questions, do feel free to let me know. Here we go. Oh, wouldn't you know, autocorrect wanted to make hapax happy. Job is not a happy book. Autocorrect can't make it so. Okay, so depending on who actually wrote this book, right, that's one whole issue. But when was this book supposed to be taking place? Unlike most books that we have in prophets and in writings that begin in their first line with letting us know who the ruler of the time was and in which year of the ruler it was, which is effectively giving us dates. Unlike almost every other book, this book doesn't tell us when it happens. Actually, there are very few markers about when this might be, such that in the Talmud, when they are discussing when this book happened, there are various guesses, including during the time of Abraham, during the time of Jacob. Later, we will find out that some believe that Job's wife was Jacob's daughter, Dinah. Some say it was during the time of Moses, and that Job was actually one of Pharaoh's advisors. Some think that it's during the time of the spies or during the time of the judges. Some place Job at the same time as King Ahasuerus and Queen Esther. And so we really don't know even when this was supposed to be happening. And there aren't a lot of hints other than the way that the scholars try to date it is through the language. But there aren't a lot of hints in the book itself about when it's supposed to be taking place. There is not even agreement on whether Job is Jewish or non-Jewish. According to the book, there is no mention of any specific Jewish character or rituals. It seems that Job is not Jewish. And so there's a question really of even what we're supposed to be understanding. He's clearly a monotheist, but that's all we have. And one other thing we know, we'll see very soon in the first verse, that it's happening in the land of Uz. And Uz is clearly outside the land of Israel. Again, kind of showing us that there are no Jewish or Israelite clear references. Finally, I want to just say one other thing about the form before we get into it. And this is going to be instructive for how we're going to be spending the 3 weeks together. And I resisted this, I'll tell you, but I just think it's kind of a useful way to organize it, even though I'm personally very resistant to what I've needed to do. So today we're only going to really be talking about the first 2 chapters. And the first 2 chapters are the prologue to the story. They are written differently. They are written in prose. This is true of the last chapter as well. We'll be doing the first 2 chapters in the first session, the last chapter in the last session, which leaves 39 chapters for next week, which is ridiculous. But this book is really set up in a very intentional way. The frame, the prologue and the epilogue are in different language than the middle chapters, which are all poetry. And the first 2 chapters set up what is going to happen, and their language is much more similar to the rest of what you would find in the Torah. The middle chapters, which we'll talk more about later, are poetry, but there are other differences as well. Scholars believe almost universally, which is shocking, that the first 2 chapters and the last chapter were originally an oral tale, a folk tale, a fable that long pre-existed this particular written account. That the author of this account was using a already pre-standing fable and turning it to their own use. And so what we're going to see in the first 2 chapters is going to set the scene, but also be very different from the middle and really the bulk of the book. And some of the things, I'll just give you, a little bit of foreshadowing to what we're going to see next week, especially. A lot of people talk about Job the patient and Job who accepts everything. We're going to see next week, he doesn't actually. He gets really angry, but we won't see that this week. And also, we know that Job's friends get a reputation for not being very supportive, but we will see in this week, up through chapter 2, they are. And so there are going to be some main differences. Another interesting one is that in the prologue and epilogue, we have the Adonai word for God. But throughout the 39 middle chapters, only Canaanite El and Elohim words are used. And so there are a lot of subtle and not so subtle differences. But let's dive in. And actually, I'll stop just for any quick questions here. Let's see, why was the book of Job included in the canonization of the Tanakh? Were there any rabbinic objections? It's a great question. And I see that a few people asked. And the scholars that I consulted also were asking this question, mainly not only because of the fact of its non-Jewish character, but mainly because its theological teachings are actually quite, how to say this, also anomalous. They don't fit easily into the rest of the theology of the Torah, and they're actually sometimes quite challenging. So the scholars that I read mainly agreed that the reason that this book is included is because it was so beloved and important. And the poetry was so moving and incandescent that they wanted it. That it dealt with questions at such a meaningful level that the anomalies weren't as important as making sure it was a part of the canon. Okay, and do scholars see a link to Greek or other foreign thinking? Great question. There are a lot of really various opinions, but this is actually seen in many ways to give us some insight into pagan thinking, because it might be that early, and other ancient Near Eastern cultures. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we see again in those 39 middle chapters is a lot of references to ancient Near Eastern mythology. And we see a reworking of a lot of the pagan religious customs into a now Jewish setting. Jewish just by the fact that it's being included in our canon. All right, I'm going to jump in because I'm hoping to get through 2 chapters in the next little bit more than a half an hour with a lot of discussion. So I'm going to read it in the Hebrew. And Julie, if you wouldn't mind, can you just cut and paste some of the, I'd rather not share screen. Is it okay if you cut and paste just the English is fine into the chat, like maybe a few verses at a time? Thank you so much. I'm going to read the Hebrew, but you'll have the English available to you. So here we go. Ish haya, a person was, there was a person, there was a man. And so for the people who are saying, who's Job? He's every man, right? Ish haya, he's just a guy. Ve'eretz Uts, and the land of Uts. Interestingly, here, Uts, that's all we have about the land. Usually we're told, again, who the ruler is, or in the, in the nation of this. We don't have any idea of an ethnicity or a king. It's just like this man is universal, doesn't even have a name. Uts is kind of universal. And by the way, many people believe that L. Frank Baum named his children's classic, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, as a echo of Uts, which of course is a Dorothy I could not mention. Okay. Eov Shemo. His name was Eov. So in Hebrew, Job is Eov, and it sounds very similar to Oyev, which is enemy, which a lot of scholars pick up on. Is he an enemy? Whose enemy is he? V'haya ha'ish hahu, and this guy was Tam, wise, v'yashar, full of integrity, v'yarei Elokim, God-fearing. So he was monotheistic and he was God-fearing. V'sar merah, and he would go away from evil. He would avoid evil. So basically, in this first verse, we hear there's a man without a name first from a place called Uts, and he was great. He was all of these positive qualities, plus he avoided evil, right? Not only was he all these good things, he didn't just stay comfortable with the fact that he was all of these good things. He would actually avoid evil. Vivaldulo shiva vanim v'shalosh banot, and he had 7 sons and 3 daughters, adding up to 10, right? A nice, round, beautiful number. We're going to see a lot of those beautiful numbers, but also 7 sons, 7, the holy number of Shabbat, right? 7 blessings at weddings. 7's a great number in Judaism, all fullness, wholeness. And 3 is a great number too, right? We have a lot of 3s as well. Vayehi miknehu shivat alfei tzon. He had 7,000 sheep, ushloshet alfei gemalim, and 3,000 camels. That's 10,000. Again, we see our 3 and our 7 and our 10. V'chamesh ma'ot semed bakar, and 500 of these flocks of sheep, and chamesh ma'ot otanot, and 500 donkeys, adding up again to 1,000. So each time we're getting these round, even numbers to show fullness. Va'avodah rabba ma'od. Vayehi ha'ish hahu gadol mikol b'nei kedem. He had a very big household, and he was greater than any person in the East. And I just want to say here, the gadol is the word in the Hebrew. In our translation here, we have wealthiest. And that certainly makes sense in the context because they're letting us know about all the stuff he has, right? When you're talking about your sheep and your flocks, this is like your bank account, right? It's basically saying how rich he is. So that's true. But I also want to point out that there's also an idea that he might just be the greatest man in the world, like from his personal qualities, that both of those can be read into that gadol, right? The 7th of Shabbat is that it's the 7th day. The 7th day. And there's a question about Uts. Uts is mentioned in Genesis as a name for a descendant of Seir the Horite, or Esau, right? So we have that name earlier in Genesis, and one of Esau's sons, Uts's sons was Eliphaz, who turns out to be one of the names of a friend. And the Edomite king list also mentions one from the Temanite land, and we have one of the friends who's also a Temanite. On the other hand, Uts also appears twice among the genealogy earlier of Aram, through Shua, Abraham's son via Keturah. So So we have this name come up a couple of different places. So nobody's really committed to defining where or what it is, except for that it's outside the land of Israel and possibly might be in the Edomite lands. Okay, so let's read on a bit. Okay. Valchu v'nav v'asu mishte beit ish yomo v'shalchu v'karu l'shoshet achiotehem le'cho v'lishtot imahem. I'm not going to do a word-to-word translation because of time. Basically, at the holidays, the children of Job would gather and they would have a big meal together. We're in verse 4 now. And they would come to one of Job's sons' houses, and they would all eat and drink together. Vayu ki hikifu yemei mishte v'yishlach Iyov v'kidashtem v'shkim b'boker v'halal olot mispar kulam ki amar Iyov ulai chatu v'nai uverchu Elokim b'levavchem kacha yaseh Iyov kol hayamin. So this is a really fascinating verse 5. When the round of feast days was over, Job would send word to them to sanctify themselves. Some believe he would actually take them himself to the mikveh, right? And rising early in the morning, he'd get up and make burnt offerings, one for each of his children. Because Job thought, maybe one of my children sinned and cursed God in their thoughts. This is what Job always used to do. And I just want to say, I find this very strange and maybe some weird form of foreshadowing. By the way, the word for curse is berchu, is blessed. And this is one example in Hebrew of words meaning what they mean and their opposite. So to bless something is also to curse it. It's a way of kind of like not saying a bad word by saying its opposite. This happens a lot in Hebrew. So in a sense, I just want to say, like, why would he think that? Why would he think that his children are cursing God in their hearts while they're giving the offerings? Either this is an example of Job going out of his way to sor merah, to keep evil away, right? Maybe we're being told that, or maybe we're being hinted somehow that like blessing and cursing are kind of interrelated, and that maybe there's a shadow side that we're getting to see before it actually happens. Okay, now we're getting into really where things go wrong. So one day, Vayehi hayom, meaning it's not a special day, any day, Vayavo b'nei ha'Elohim, the sons of God. Okay, now this is crazy, right? Who are the sons of God? Later in your source sheet, I showed you a place early in Genesis in chapter 6 where we have b'nei Elohim. And it's right before Noah. And it's, you know, it seems to be these kind of divine beings or the celestial court. They're sitting together, lihit yatsev al Hashem, with God, v'yavo gam hasatan. And this is translated here as not Satan comes, but the adversary. Because Satan here, the Hebrew with the ha, the definite article, designates not a proper name, not here Satan, but the adversary, a role or a function. And we have this character come up in a couple of different places. You'll see again later in your source sheet in Midrash. I'm not going to go through it right now, but a lot of scholars compare this to the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, where in the Midrash, in the legends, there's an idea that this same character, the adversary, Hasatan, comes and says, look, Abraham's not really, you think he's so great, but maybe, it's just because everything's going his way, because he's got this son. He just had a big feast too. And did he give you any sacrifices? No, they were all for his son. And God says, well, if you think that's true, watch. Abraham loves me so much, if I ask him, he'll even kill his son, right? And you'll see the echoes here, because that's exactly what the Satan says to him here. After God says, and I'm just going to go a little faster here in the English, God says to the Satan, where have you been? He says, I've been looking all over the earth. And God says to the Satan, oh, you've seen everyone. You're taking a wide view. Well, have you noticed my servant Job? There's no one like him on earth. This is verse 8. A blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. And for all of you, who remember grandparents not mentioning, the grandchildren's names, or saying they're ugly because poo, 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 who wants to invite the Satan, right? Who wants to invite the evil eye? This is what God is violating right now. God's saying, isn't Job great? To the accuser, right? And so it's Satan's job to say, yeah, I've noticed him. Does Job not have good reason to fear God? Why? It's you who have fenced him round, him and his household and all that he has. You've blessed his efforts so that his possessions spread out in the land. But lay your hand upon all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. So the Satan, the adversary, is saying, yeah, Job's great, but Job gets everything he wants. It's not hard to be great when you're wealthy, when things come easily to you, when you've got 10 kids, when everyone thinks you're great. Big deal. Take it all away. Job's going to curse you to your face, God. Not sure exactly what that means, to your face, but we will see. That also might be some kind of foreshadowing. So God replies to the Satan, okay, take all that he has in your power, just don't kill him, just don't hurt him. The adversary departs from the presence of the Lord. And I just want to show you in the Hebrew what happens. So one day, again, we have one day, as his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their eldest brother, a messenger comes to Job and says, the oxen were plowing and the she-asses were grazing alongside them when Sabaeans attacked them and carried them off and put the boys to the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was speaking, Od ze midaber, that one is already still speaking. Vizeba vayomer, and another one came and said, God's fire fell from the heaven, took hold of the sheep and the boys and burned them up. I alone have escaped to tell you. Rak ani levadi lehagid lecha. That is repeated over and over. Both of these, the beginning and the end of each of these verses, will be the same. Od ze midaber v'ze ba v'yomer. And the end, Rak ani levadi lahagid lach. In each case, it will say, this one was still speaking when another came and said, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So the next one, a Chaldean formation of 3 columns made a raid on the camels and carried them off and put the boys to the sword. And then the final, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their eldest brother. when suddenly a mighty wind came from the wilderness. It struck the four corners of the house so that it collapsed upon the young people and they died. I alone have escaped to tell you. So we just see Satan wastes no time. He immediately wipes out all of Job's wealth, but more importantly, he murders all of his children. And I just want to take a moment just to acknowledge that this is horrific. This is horrific. And what we see in Job is his reaction to this. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, but the destruction comes in all forms of the earth, in wind, air, in fire. Don't have water yet, but we'll see water later. And in the ground itself. It's like the earth itself is rejecting Job and all of the elements. So what does Job do? Vayakam Eov, Job gets up, Vayikrat me'ilo, and he rips his garment, his coat. Vayagaz et rosho, cuts off his hair, shaves off his hair. Vayipol artza, and he falls to the ground. Vayishtachu, and he bows. And in our translation, it says he worships. It's not clear to me that that's what's happening. He's just in a prostrate form, right? He's just getting as close to the earth as he can. He humbles himself. All of these are gestures of mourning, cutting his hair and ripping his clothes and falling to the ground. He's just reacting as a mourner. Right? For those of you who, some of you may know when you hear of a death of someone beloved to you, or if you personally witness death, the Jewish law is that you rip your clothing. This is why, some people cut the black ribbons, at a funeral. So he's just his first reaction is just the reactions of profound mourning. But then he speaks. And these are very famous lines. Vayomer, Arom yatzati mi betnin imi. Naked, I left the belly of my mother. Va'arom ashuv, and naked I will return. Shama. And naked I will return there. Of course, not to the womb, but in death. Adonai Natan, God gave, Hashem Natan, God gave, Vashem Lakach, and God took, Yehi Shem Hashem Mivorach, may the name of God be blessed. God gave, God took, may the name of God be blessed. And here when we have Mivorach, right? Mivorach, we assume that it does mean blessed and not cursed, even though we had that same verb used as cursed before. B'chol zot, now we have a narrator, just letting us know, with all of that happened, lo chata Eov, Job didn't sin even then. V'lo natan tefillah l'Elohim. Didn't even cast reproach on God. Tefillah here not as prayer, but as judgment, from the root palal. Okay, this is shocking stuff, right? Just to say, this is shocking stuff. And I want to just, let's take a second here. Feel free, before I relate to the questions, or as I do, feel free just to write in the chat how you feel about this. Not the thinking, but like, what are your emotions reading this at this point in the story? Anger. Yeah, I devastated, revulsion. Right. This is what I was, confusion. I feel very confused too. And I just want to point out enraged, sorrow, terror, right? Should I trust? This is unfair, right? This is horrible. And I just want to say that the rabbis of the Talmud feel the same way. And I want to quote to you something from the Talmud, from the Babylonian Talmud, Baba Batra. Amal Rabbi Yochanan says, Ilmale mikra katuv, except since there's a written verse. The only way I could believe this is because there's a written verse. If shal amro, we would never be able to say this. Ke adam shemisitin oto v'nisit, because what we're seeing here is that God seems to be like a person whom others persuade and who allows themselves to be persuaded. Why does God enter into this seeming game? This feels more like Greek mythology, where the gods are playing around with the humans and their lives mean nothing. That's not our theology. Is Job just a pawn between these two? And what about his children? Not even looking at Job's suffering. What does it mean for God to allow the children to die? And some of you may be wondering, where's their mother in all of this? What's going on? All right, so I'm going to just stop for a moment to take one or two questions, because then I do want to do chapter 2. Let's see. If you want to actually ask a question, feel free to come off mute. I'm just scrolling through to see if I see an actual question. All right, I think I'm going to continue on, and then we'll have some time at the end, hopefully, for a few questions. So we're going into chapter 2 wondering, what is going on here? Why does God agree to this? And why isn't Job getting angry, right? Although we can just tell he's in shock right now. We could also just say he's in shock. So this is how we begin chapter 2. Vayehi hayom vayavo bnei Elohim lityatzev al Hashem vayavo gam hasatan betocham lityatzev al Hashem. Again, one day, we don't know how much longer ago this was from what we saw. One day, the same group gathers. Bnei Elohim are talking with God, and Hasatan joins them. The accuser joins them. And God does the same thing. Vayomer Hashem al Hasatan, God says to the Satan, Imizet tavo, where have you been? Vayana Satan, and Satan answers at Hashem, Vayomer, Mishet ba'aretz, I've been roaming the world. Umit halechba, and I've just been wandering the world. And again, God says, have you noticed my servant Job? There's no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. He still keeps his integrity. So you have incited me against him to destroy him for no good reason. Did you notice? You told me he was going to curse me and he didn't curse me. You lost. Checkmate. So Satan says, skin for skin, which scholars agree must be some kind of proverb that makes sense and in their own time, but which we don't really understand. All that a man has, he will give up for his life. but lay a hand on his bones and his flesh, and he will surely blaspheme you to your face. Right? Okay, so you took away everything he's got. But like you said, don't touch his body. But if I can touch his body, then now he's going to curse you. So God says to the Satan, okay, do anything to his body, just don't kill him. Which, again, this is just brutal, unfair, horrific. So Satan inflicts a severe inflammation on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, meaning he's just having, a terrible rash all over his body, a painful, terrible rash. He takes a potsherd, a piece of pottery, a shard, to scratch himself as he sits in ashes. And his wife says to him, "You still keep your integrity. Blaspheme God, curse God, and die." This is our first introduction to Job's wife. Why haven't we heard about her before? She's completely implicated in all of this too. Were they not her children? Some say maybe she was his second wife and they weren't his children, her children. Some say again in the Midrash that this is Dinah, who after all of her suffering is now continuing her suffering. And he says to her, "You talk as any shameless woman might talk. Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil? For all that, Job said nothing sinful." And when Job's 3 friends heard about all these calamities that had befallen him, each came from his home. And the precise location of these homelands is debated by scholars, but they seem to be through a spread of a few hundred miles to the east of Jordan. Eliphaz the Temanite, what we call Yemen, Bildad the Shuhite, and Sophar the Naamite. They met together to go and console and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they couldn't recognize him, and they broke into loud weeping. Each one tore his robe, again in mourning, and threw dust into the air onto his head. And then I just want to share with you the end of chapter 2, because this is going to be so different from what we see from the friends. Vayashivu ito, and they sat with him. La'aretz, on the ground, shivat yamim, for 7 days. They sat shiva with him, 7 full days. And what happens when you sit shiva? Some of you may know there's a Jewish law that when you go to a shiva house, you're not supposed to greet the mourner. You're not supposed to say anything to the mourner until the mourner speaks first. V'shivat leilot, 7 nights, ve'ein dover alav, and they never spoke to him because he never spoke. So they just all sat for 7 days and nights in silence together. Ki ra'u, because they saw, ki gadal ha'ke'ev ma'od, that his pain had grown greatly. And I just want to point out the same word here we saw in the first chapter, gadol. The man who was the greatest in all the East is now the greatest, gadal, the largest, the most impressive in pain and suffering. He's gone from the greatest man to the greatest man in suffering. Okay. There's a little bit more I want to do, but I'll open it up for some questions or comments. Oh, here's from, I just want to say that Sally's comment, how to be a friend to someone who is suffering, wait for them to speak, it's about them. You are there to witness and listen. I think that this whole book, in many ways, is to teach us that lesson. And that though we focus on the characters who are featured in the first 2 and the last chapter, which we will be doing as well, truly, the people who take up most of the book are the friends. And here, in the separate part, the frame story, the fable part, before we get into what our author really wants to do, he is, I believe, showing us a model of what good friends can do before we get to something different. So here's a question. Micah Goodman of Shalom Hartman Institute gave a series of lectures on YouTube presenting a very different and radical interpretation of Job. I'd be curious what you think of it, perhaps sometimes in the next sessions. I'll check it out. Let's see. Question. This isn't God just acting in the sense of bad things happening. This is God gambling with, this is God making bad things happen. That's exactly right. And what I want to say about this is that my sense of it, and this may not be satisfying to you, my sense of it is the author doesn't really believe in this story. He's using it as a setup. And I want to share with you, in that vein, some other quotes. Elie Wiesel. Well, before I get to that, in the end of the source sheet, you'll see that there's a piece from the Talmud that's saying, who is Job? Job lo haya velo nivra. Job was never existing and was never created, meaning this whole thing never happened. It's just a pretense. It's a fable. Literally, the Talmud says, mashal haya. It was a parable, right? It was a folk tale, and it's just an opportunity to talk about these things. Don't think God ever did this. God never did this. Elie Wiesel said, there were those who claimed that Job did exist, but that his sufferings are sheer literary inventions. Then there were those who declared that while Job never existed, he undeniably did suffer. I think this is the fascinating part. Though he never actually existed, he did suffer. Meaning, there's something about stories that allows us to experience truth or meet the truth of our experience beyond whether they actually happened or not. So even if Job never was, his suffering was, right? Meaning, maybe we don't need to hold so tightly to the idea that God is making this happen. Maybe what we're supposed to get from these first two chapters is that it's not Job's fault, that Job's blameless. That's an important piece of the story, an assumption. And so if we know, which we don't generally in real life, right? Someone is blameless, right? What are they supposed to do with their suffering? How can they hold on to both their suffering and their faith at the same time? That's a question that they want us to ask. On your sheet, there's a poem from Dan Pagis, who survived the Shoah. He survived Auschwitz. From this, he's a Hebrew poet. From the start, the forces were unequal. Satan, a grand seigneur in heaven, Job, mere flesh and blood. And anyway, the contest was unfair. Job, who had lost all his wealth and been bereaved of his sons and daughters and stricken with loathsome boils, wasn't even aware that it was a contest. Because he complained too much, the referee silenced him. So having accepted this decision in silence, he defeated his opponent without even realizing it. Therefore, his wealth was restored. He was given sons and daughters, new ones, of course, and his grief for the first children was taken away. We might imagine that this retribution was the most terrible thing of all. We might imagine that the most terrible thing was Job's ignorance, not understanding whom he had defeated, or even that he had won. But in fact, the most terrible thing of all is that Job never existed. and is just a parable. Here we have not only a Holocaust survivor, but also a tremendous poet and scholar of medieval Hebrew poetry, saying maybe the worst thing would be if there is no meaning at all to our suffering. And how do we hold on? This is the question of theodicy, to a divine that is powerful and good, and a world that has meaning when good people suffer. And this week, we focused on Job and Job's experience. Next week, we're going to be looking not at what Job thinks, but what the friends think. And finally, in our last session, what God thinks. I'm looking forward. I'm going to read the whole chat later. I'm sorry I couldn't respond more, but hopefully next week will be a little bit more interactive. Bring your questions, bring your comments, and I hope you'll join me again next week. May our learning be for a blessing to us, to all who suffer, which means all of the creatures of the world. Thank you.